We are Pro Cannabis Media.
We're back. Welcome back to Weed Talk Live. I'm Jimmy Young.
And I'm Curt Dalton.
And we welcome in Chris Liska, who is the Chief Science Officer at Alternative Compassion Services, one of the better dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, down in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And Chris, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
And tell us a little bit about what you do as a Chief Science Officer at a medical dispensary. And get a little bit closer to that microphone so that we can all hear you, too. There you go. Good job, Curt. You get an assist on that.
Woo.
Basically, oversee the extraction of cannabis products that are made into concentrates for various products. From distillation, where we create a distillate that's used for topicals and edibles. We also have vape products that are extracted, and we have several different types of extraction that we use depending on what we're making. And that's kind of my wheelhouse, is sort of that side of things.
You are a scientist. I've met more scientists in the cannabis space over the last year and a half since I've thrown myself into this industry than I ever thought before. It's just fascinating to me that you can look at a plant and then dissect the chemicals that are in this plant. It blows my mind because I was never a science guy.
Yeah, it's. I think that's one of the things that attracted me to cannabis in general, was that there's so much to it. It's not a single compound. It's many compounds, and I think that's one thing that, particularly for me, is that when talking to people like my dad, and now he has a better understanding of it, but people of his generation sometimes think all cannabis is the same, and it's really not. Because you have different terpenes, you have different cannabinoids, and there's so many different compounds that you can create so many different combinations of plants.
Absolutely. Curt.
I want to, just a sentence you said right there. I want to say a sentence and you comment on it. Today's cannabis is 10 times stronger than what we had in the 70s or 80s.
I wouldn't say that that's accurate. I'd say that there's a lot of things contributing to that statement. One is storage techniques. How was the cannabis stored before it was tested? How was it tested? What method was it used? Was it HPLC? Was it mass spec? And there's a difference as to the testing methodologies, because if you do an HPLC test, you're actually testing the acidic form of the cannabinoids. Whereas if you're doing a mass spec test, you're going to test it in its decarboxylated form, because it actually it combusts the sample in order to test it.
So, just to clarify that, if anti-pot people say it's 10 times stronger and the THC is just off the charts from what we're used to, you would say, hold up.
Right. Yeah. If you were to look at let's say a sample from like the 70s, and you were able to somehow bring it to today and have it in a storage methodology that was similar to the way that we would prepare it before we send a sample out, I think you'd find that it would be a little bit less, but not as drastic as what people think. Obviously, you're going to see some increase in cannabinoids when you have indoor growing. You have, people have gone to a greenhouse, and there's a lot of evolution of the plant, and people being involved with its growing that's changed that. So I'm sure that it's improved the cannabinoid levels to a certain extent, but I wouldn't say that it's that astronomical now.
One of the words that seems to accompany the cannabinoids and the new verbiage about cannabis is terpenes. We hear this a lot. We hear about myrcene and other scenes, and please explain to our audience what a terpene is and how important it is actually in the development and the of the concentrates.
So there's terpenes are aromatic hydrocarbons. They're a component of the plant that, in this case, gives it its smell. And they interact with other aspects of the plant, the cannabinoids, the aldehydes, ketones, ethers. There's a lot of other things that are in the plant, not just terpenes, that contribute to what's referred to as the entourage effect. The entourage effect is something that is present when you have one compound that its effectiveness will be increased by the presence of other compounds, and that's what's happening in the case of cannabis, is that the cannabinoids are more readily able to cross the blood-brain barrier because of the presence of terpenes and ketones, aldehydes, things like that. Which that's why it's a misnomer. A lot of people think that when they look for cannabis, they're looking for high TAC, they're looking for high cannabinoid all the time. And they're, in a lot of ways, missing out on a lot of really, therapeutic potential strains, because there's so many out there that are high in these different terpenes and different compounds that may not be a 23% THC strain. It may be 14, but it may have, some THCV in it, and it may contain, a high amount of, beta caryophyllene or something like that. Or, there's a different...
I'm sorry. I think I was not a science guy.
He's wicked smart, dude. Wicked smart.
He had all these scientists. It's amazing. They use words. Not only don't I know what they mean, but I never heard these words before. And that's kind of, you could make fun of me if you want, because it is what it is. You can do that.
So this is a great point you brought up. A lot of people might not know the entourage effect, and we'll make fun of Jimmy later, is that the world is shifting to CBD from hemp, and so many people say, "I don't want THC. I drug test. I work. No THC." For those that are in the industry, know there's a little debate. Entourage effect, whole plant medicine. You need all those cannabinoids, all the other things in that plant for your arthritis, for your PTSD. It's not about getting high, but we don't understand the plant enough to just say, give me THCV and CBD. So can you explain why? I assume you're a fan of whole plant medicine and
Correct.
What the entourage, is it real, and what does it mean?
Yeah, there's the whole plant encompasses like so much more in the activity of like what the plant can do. If you have let's say you have a really uncommon cannabinoid for some reason present, like THCV in a high amount. That by itself is not really going to be, it may have some like appetite suppressing qualities to it, but it's going to be much more effective when it's in combination with other cannabinoids like THC. The same thing's found to be true with CBD, is that CBD in a lot of recent experiments and studies has shown to be more effective when it's with some THC, a very small amount. So, and then the addition of terpenes obviously makes a big difference there as well. The big thing I think with a lot of the CBD products that we're seeing is that they're isolates. Because when they do a hemp extraction for CBD, and they're going to export it from a state to state, they can't have any THC in it.
Right.
So it has to be remediated, and all of the THC has to be removed. So then you get to the point where you only have 99.99% CBD. You've removed all that stuff. There's no terpenes left. There's nothing else at that point. So I'm sure it has some therapeutic value, but not as much as it did when it contained those terpenes, which is why when we do a CBD preparation, I prefer to use we decarboxylate the plant material, and then we do an extraction where we leave the terpenes in, which is unusual because usually you destroy the terpenes, but we're able to separate them in the process we do and then put them back in. So it has a more pronounced effect.
And in just a few minutes, we're going to bring in Dr. Jordan Tishler of Inhale MD, and I'll tell you a little anecdotal story about Jordan at that time. But he is one who has warned anybody who would listen, and he has spoken at many conventions about the dangers of vaping. There's been a lot of concern about what goes in this particular concentrate. Again, it really shows why regulation is going to be so important, because most of the medical dispensaries, in fact, I will say all of the medical dispensaries in Massachusetts, have everything that goes out to the public is tested by CDX labs, MCR labs, take your pick of the lab, that's safe. I just want to make sure that people understand that if you are using a concentrate from a medicinal dispensary in Massachusetts, those concentrates are still safe. Now, the question is, what happens when it gets vaped? Now, can you take me through that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a couple things about vapes. one thing that's critical when you vaporize something is that it doesn't contain lipids and wax. So one of the things that we do with products that are going to be vaporized is it goes through a dewaxing or winterization process where we're able to remove those lipids in that wax, and then it gives it a much cleaner vaporization. You don't have any of the degradation products that are created, and it avoids things like lipoid pneumonia. That's one of the issues that you see with a lot of unregulated carts, street carts, things like that. They're not required to meet any kind of standards, so they're cut with all kinds of different things to change the viscosity of the oil in order to use cheaper carts, in order to get more carts. And a lot of the things that people are using are not really meant to have ever been vaporized, like vitamin E acetate.
Yeah.
I mean, that, for instance, is obviously something that, is problematic.
Yeah, and we've seen now 7 dead, 530 lung diseases reported by the various states to the CDC, and it is a concern, and we are going to talk more about that with the doctor once we get him on the phone. We have him on the phone? We do, so we can actually bring him in right now. The good doctor, Dr. Jordan Tishler, joins us. Hello, Jordan. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me on.
Well, this is, when it comes to this kind of thing, I go back to when you and I first met in March of 2018, and I sat in one of your breakout sessions at the New England Cannabis Convention, and you warned at that time about vaping. And here we are, where you get to say, I told you so. Right, Jordan? Come on.
I guess I do. I get to say I told you so. It doesn't make me feel very happy about it, but here we are.
Tell us about where are we right now as we look at the vaping, I'll call it a crisis, and what is your concern as a cannabis expert who has his patients, obviously. This is your most important thing, is your relationship with your patients and what you tell them. I'm sure you've handled a lot of questions about this over the last few weeks.
Yes, absolutely. There's been a lot of press and some warnings from various governmental agencies. And as my patients are generally paying attention to these sorts of things. And so I've gotten many calls and emails with sort of anguished concern. Most of my patients, when we're talking about using this stuff by inhalation, my recommendation has always been to vaporize flower with a quality vaporizer, and so most of my patients are doing that, and therefore they really don't have any exposure to these cartridges. Some of them have been persuaded to use cartridges, and I think now they're rethinking that in light of this. There are many issues here. There's obviously your other guest was mentioning some of the additives like the vitamin E acetate. That's clearly a problem in the current crisis, as you called it. But I think that the broader issue here is that the cartridge systems, these oil pens, really were never designed to meet the sort of stringent needs of proper vaporization without the creation of products of combustion. And so even without the crisis that we're seeing now, I've always felt that these things were not really up to par, up to safety, and that it's a technological issue, but yet nobody has stepped in so far to build a better vaporizer pen, and so we're stuck with the technology that we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I have to ask this question of a doctor. You would be the doctor. Chris, I think you and I actually talked about this earlier. Chris Liska is the science officer at Alternative Compassion Services down in Bridgewater, Jordan. He is in studio with us along with Curt Dalton from Cannabis.net. And one of the things that I've been reading up about how the doctors are looking at putting not a gas like oxygen or smoke in your lungs, but actually putting a wet product, a vapor product into your lungs, and the effect that that has on your lungs, making it more susceptible to viruses and bacteria. And yet I hear you say it's still okay to vaporize flower, but it's still putting a vapor in your lungs, isn't it?
Well, I mean, vapor is... I guess that's a good question. The reality is that it depends on what that vapor is. It's not simply the issue of its being, a liquid in its semi-gaseous state. So, we all breathe water vapor, right, that's in the air. Right?
Steam.
So it's not simply the issue of its being a liquid. It really depends on what that liquid is. And so one of your other guests had mentioned something about lipoid pneumonia, and that's a very real risk when we inhale a volatilized oil. That's not burned oil. That's just oil that has become a vapor that we are inhaling. And the problem is that when we get that oil into our lungs really don't know what to do with that, and so you get this kind of inflammatory reaction. Or you can get that inflammatory reaction, and that can be very, very damaging. So I think it's just not as simple as saying you don't want any sort of vapor. It really depends upon what it is. When we look at the studies that look at people who've smoked cannabis for years, decades really, what we've seen is that they don't seem to develop the kinds of problems that we would expect based on tobacco smoking. And I think that those of us who've been watching this don't understand why that's the case, and that makes us very wary. But the data are fairly convincing. And so we like to avoid many of the particulates and nasty chemicals that we find in cannabis smoke, mostly as a way of hedging our bets here so that we don't see, patients develop problems down the line that were unanticipated. But the bottom line is if you're using a vaporizer, a true flower quality vaporizer at the correct temperature, you're avoiding all of those particulates and you're avoiding all of those products of combustion, which again is just a further hedge to say, look, this is a purer substance. We're really inhaling just cannabinoids and terpenoids. And so it's that much less likely that we're going to see problems.
Jordan, this is Curt from Cannabis.net, and I think you actually, both our scientists, agree on this, and it's kind of dividing the media, the country, including my own household with my wife. Would you say it's not vaping that's the problem, it's what you're vaping, is the first question. I think you both now agree on that. And two is vaping healthier than smoking? Forget what the substance is, tobacco, cannabis, etc. Would you agree with those two sentences?
Well, I certainly agree with the first one. It's definitely what you're vaping. The question of whether vaping is inherently safer than smoking sort of becomes a political question, and one that I'm not sure I want to weigh in on. But I will say that that one thing we can say for sure is we know a lot more about smoking and the long-term effect, and we don't have as great a handle on what the outcomes of vaping may be. So I'd love to say, sure, if we're vaping, it's probably safer than smoking, but I don't think that we have enough evidence or experience with it to really say that definitively. I will say that, again, I think that vaping the flower at the right temperature simply produces far fewer concerning chemicals, and as such is probably the safest of all.
All right, I'm going to pull my best point guard and pass it to the left. You're nodding. The audience couldn't see you. It's what you're vaping as opposed to actual vaporizing, and is vaping better than smoking overall?
Yeah, this is for Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
I would definitely agree with the first one, and I would also agree with Dr. Tishler on the second, in that there just isn't enough data on vaping to be able to make a determination to conclusively say that. I would agree that vaporizing flower is probably more it's probably healthier than smoking, but you can't really definitively say that without having the data to back up, over the time,
Right. Now here's some data. Cartridges sales and concentrate sales in Massachusetts have gone down 25% since mid-August. So obviously people are saying, I'm not going to do this, but I keep saying that at all medical dispensaries, okay, you've got to have confidence in the extraction process, that the people who are handling the flower know what they're doing. All the people that I know that handle the flower know what they're doing. Here's a little curve for everybody, since I have a medical card and I do inhale my cannabis, and I have used vapes, and I'll tell you this, because of the convenience of the pen or the C-cell cartridges, you do tend to do more of it, and as opposed to going through the whole thing about smoking it, because if you're going to smoke, you're probably going to be going outside type of thing. So that's something that I have noticed immediately as soon as I've gotten rid of my vapes, that I'm not doing it as much. And I think it's got to be a good thing, as long as you could still get access to your medicine. Dr. Tishler?
You hit a great point, Jimmy. Dr. Tishler, like, what could you tell the public when they're saying, how do I know my vape is safe?
Yeah, well, I think that's, again, I think that there are two issues here. One is, in this current crisis, how do we know what additives have been put into the cartridge? And frankly, I think the answer to that is it's pretty hard to know. In Massachusetts, where these things tend to be pretty tightly regulated, I think that we have a greater confidence that nothing too terrible has been put in there. I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of a bit of a head scratcher to me is that now that we're finding out that this vitamin E is at least a potential culprit, I have to ask, who thought that this was a good idea? Right?
Someone who smoked too much weed, actually, I think, Jordan, and was trying to make a quick buck. And it's mostly in the illegal market.
Right, exactly. But the thing is that what I'm really getting at is that people who know the science and know medicine know that vitamin E in particular is a very allergenic substance.
Exactly.
So if you get a vitamin E moisturizer and you rub it on your skin, there's a fairly significant risk of developing a rash. On the other hand, a rash on your skin is a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. A rash in your lungs, which is essentially what these people are getting, is, potentially fatal. And so I think that, part of the problem here is that you need to get your material, your vape, from a group of people that you have reason to have confidence that they have some idea what they're doing, and that's where regulation through the Cannabis Control Commission comes in. So I think that that's a good step. I would then go further and say even the cartridges that are manufactured in an appropriate way still have the problem of being of overheating and combusting the material, and that is sort of the longer term risk that I advise patients to avoid.
Yeah, I would agree that they're not. It's not a sophisticated device.
Right.
Yeah, they're very inexpensive. One of the other problems I see with cartridges is that a lot of them, they don't have to meet a standard of any kind. So the manufacturing standards can be really low. And then you run the risk of contamination by heavy metals.
Right.
So, I mean, there's another reason to really make sure that, wherever they're coming from, the source, and that they're, using the best product they can. And like I know that all dispensaries are required to do heavy metal testing, but you want to make sure the carts they're using are good carts too.
Good point.
Right.
Good point.
The oil may have no heavy metals in it to start with, but by the time it's been vaporized through a device that is emitting the heavy metals itself, then your exposure is still there. And the flip side of that is, just how much responsibility do we think can reasonably be left on the shoulders of a patient to know all of these things about what's in the cartridge and whether the device is well made and that sort of thing. And I think the answer, when I think about my 60, 80, 90-year-old patients, I think that that's asking an unreasonable amount of savviness on their part, and that the fundamental essence of a patient is that they're only really looking to feel better. And it's not like they want to take this on as a hobby. There are certainly lots of stoners out there that want to get into the details because it's interesting to them, and that's fine. But really, when we think about patients, they simply want to take the medicine, feel better, and go on with their lives. So, then it becomes really incumbent upon, well, frankly, the government as the regulating body here to make sure that they don't need to do all of that homework because, quite frankly, the product only gets to market when it is safe enough.
It's pretty interesting because Forbes ran a piece, I think, this week claiming that this two reasons that you may see marijuana legalization sped up is this health scare, as well as the inability of police to distinguish between hemp and marijuana crossing the country. We covered it at cannabis.net and wrote an editorial or an opinion saying, this is really the U.S. federal government's fault. They saw legalization coming when California went with the Trump election. They didn't get ahead of it. They pointed fingers. Republicans didn't want to go there. Democrats tiptoed. And now we have this. We called it gas station CBD because we kind of tied it in with these hemp bombs you're finding at your gas stations. We have this health mess, which is killing people. How much is to blame is the U.S. federal government for not getting ahead of this and saying the arbitrage between the black market and the legal market is so great and the incentive is so great to drive a pound of weed from California to New York City or create a quick buck money grab by mixing things into your oils. How much blame should we put on the federal government for not stepping up? And will this cause the federal government to speed things up and say, whoa, we have to have testing, we have to have a specific way to protect people?
Well, I think the federal government really needs to step up. There's no question about that.
Do you know what they did today? By the way, I got to interrupt, Jordan. Do you know what they did today? They agreed to spend $3 million on research on whether CBD works for pain relief. Isn't that a little late to the game, considering the Farm Bill was passed in December? Maybe they should have done that before they made the Farm Bill. I'm just saying.
Of course. Well, the problem here is there's science and there's money. And, earlier in the evening, I was hanging out with one of my friends who's a lawyer and a businessman. And, his point was that frankly, capitalism and healthcare are often very much at odds with each other. Yes, now we have CBD on every street corner that may be tainted with all manner of stuff, and people out there saying CBD is good for this, that, and the other thing, when in fact it's really never been proven to be good for much of anything other than, say, treating seizures in children with genetic seizure disorders. So, again, I don't recommend CBD to people, and I certainly don't recommend the stuff that you're getting kind of online or at the Whole Foods or any of that sort of thing, because it is unproven and unregulated, and that's just a disaster waiting to happen. It's the vape cartridge part 2, and it just hasn't hit yet.
Oh, you took the words right out of our article. That's the next one, gas station CBD. Wait till that gets tested, and somebody, whatever happens from that is going to not be good.
We need more regulation. Dr. Jordan Tishler, as always, a pleasure to talk with you, and I always feel like when we end our conversation, I feel like I could talk with you for another 30 minutes or 40 minutes because you are a wealth of information, sir. Inhale MD is how you find Dr. Jordan Tishler, and I look forward to seeing you at a conference near you sometime. Okay, Jordan?
That sounds lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice chatting with you guys. Take care now.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
So, Chris, before we wrap you up and say goodbye to you, I do want to revisit something we discussed over dinner. I want you to take me through the process of what happens inside that cartridge. I was under the impression that it heated up and it combusted the oil, and that's what you were breathing in vapor. But you're telling me I'm wrong, of course.
Well, by design, it's not supposed to do that. But like Dr. Tishler was saying, that in a lot of cases, these cartridges are not a sophisticated piece of equipment and they overheat. And that therein lies the issue with combustion. They're supposed to heat to before combustion just to vaporize whatever's in the cartridge, but that isn't always what happens. It has to be a higher quality cartridge.
Yeah, we've been able to show a couple of videos of your lab that you built. Can we just run that? We're going to go overtime a little bit here. I'd like to run it again, Chris, and just walk us through it. I mean, I know I see a lot of beakers, and I see a lot of liquids, and I see some other stuff. Can you explain what's going on here? There are the cartridges being filled, right?
Cartridges, yeah. Those are, they look like they're distillate cartridges.
The Grateful Bread,
We got
by the
some
way.
Chem Dog in there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what do we have here? We've extracted the stuff, and now it's goo.
Well, so in some cases we do a CO2
You're
extraction.
a scientist, aren't you?
And there's CO2 that's left in the oil when it comes out of the extractor. So we put it on a hot plate in order to get some of it to boil off. He's actually carbon scrubbing that right there to remove chlorophyll from it.
Wow.
That's a warm ethanol extraction that's going to be winterized. Actually, it has been winterized now.
And patients can come into your Bridgewater dispensary and get your products that we're seeing here.
Yes.
Great. What's the address?
It's Elm Street, Bridgewater.
Okay,
Yep.
Elm Street, Bridgewater, for those that want to know that this gentleman gives the thumbs approval, which I would trust in a heartbeat.
That's right.
If you're worried, Bridgewater.
And I will say it's outstanding. It's been reviewed very positively, the ACS stuff that's being grown on site. And the cartridges and the concentrates and the edibles, I understand, are some of the best in the biz. That's what I
definitely.
hear, right?
Yep.
And again, this is not me. These are all reports that you read on Reddit and some of the review sites. So, Chris, you do a great job, and you constantly amaze me with your brain power, because it is so far ahead and over me. It's bizarre. So anyway, hey, do me a favor and wish Stephen Werther all the best.
Oh, definitely.
And an old childhood friend of mine is down there at ACS running things, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.